Howdy, and welcome to the Aggie Teach Momentum podcast, brought to you by the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences program at Texas A&M University. I am your host, Kenrick Davies, former high school physics and astronomy teacher and current program manager for Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences. This podcast is meant to provide a little more insight and information to those seeking a secondary content teacher certification in Texas. We aim to provide episodes that help reservice educators on the path to certification, as well as leverage the experience of myself and other guest speakers to support teachers in their first few years in the classroom. And today's topic is one that's kind of been building for a little bit in the back of my head. I think it's really going to be a great conversation here. And it's essentially just about making content relevant to our students within the classroom. And I've got a couple of really great guests in the studio today. I have Dr. Justin Randolph, who's an assistant professor in the history department at Texas A&M University. And I have Adam Cook, laboratory manager and senior forensic engineer for Ethos Engineering and Testing. He's also a member of the Houston chapter of the ASM International, ASM being American Society of Metals. And I'll let him talk about his involvement with that in just a second. But I'll throw it to Dr. Randolph. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in your current position here at A&M?
Sure, great, and thanks for having me. I'm an assistant professor of history here at A&M, and it's sort of a long path into the historical profession. But I'm the first in my family to go to college. I actually
Nice.
started at a community college in rural Alabama, where I grew up. Transferred to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I sort of fell in love with Southern history, specifically histories of the Civil Rights Movement and the period of Jim Crow segregation in the American South. And moved on to graduate school at Yale University and got my first job in Texas, actually, out of graduate school at Texas State University in San Marcos. And
Yeah.
there I taught for 4 years in the public history program. And so A&M hired me as a public historian, and I do that in class. So public history, for folks who don't know, is really defined by trying to put history to work in the world. So that's, sort of outside of academia, things like museums, archives, state and national parks, historic preservation of old buildings and homes, things like that.
Nice. I mean, talk about making content relevant, right? You're kind of living in that space. One follow-up question, because I know, in the secondary realm where we live here in Aggie Teach, we are lovers of our content, but we also love teaching and education. So if I had to ask a question like, what's your favorite part about being an educator here at A&M?
Oh, I mean, I love the students. I love the curiosity that folks bring into the classroom. And there's something about A&M that sort of breeds a love and curiosity of history specifically. So getting students who are sort of already revved up for that when they get in the room makes my job a lot easier.
That's great. That's fantastic. All right, Adam, what about you? Can you give us a little bit about your background and your work?
Sure. So I started out in a very rural part of Illinois and Kentucky. Started out at Southern Illinois University. Ended up transitioning over to University of Kentucky. They had a branch campus for non-traditional students for mechanical and chemical engineering. So I started off in that, and I'm just kind of worked my way through the program. Graduated, and I had some family in Houston, so they brought me down to where there's a honestly much healthier job market. And while I was doing that, I ended up working at the Space Center for a couple of years in their facilities division. Got to see a lot of really cool behind the scenes stuff. And unfortunately, the group that I was working with was primarily supporting the shuttle program.
Mhm.
And 2 years after that, the official word came down that they were starting to shutter the shuttle program. I said, okay, time to look for something else. So I started looking
Right.
around and found my current job position just listed on the internet. Said, oh, that sounds neat. Let's check it out. And just absolutely fell in love with it. It's basically working puzzles backwards. And it's like CSI for metal parts is how I describe it for a lot of people.
That's really, really cool. And so I know with your work with ASM, you've kind of fell into this educational realm. So I know you're not, a trained teacher, but you do a lot of stuff in education. So what is your favorite part about being involved with the educators here in Texas?
Honestly, I really enjoy the community give back portion of it because as somebody that's in the science and engineering realm, like it's always touted as like STEM, oh science, oh engineering, great, but engineers have a classically very well disturbed just deserved reputation for being less than fantastic communicators.
Nice.
And but it is a field both on the technical side, there because there's really kind of I view it as like the college side and the vocational side are really tightly interwoven because you have to have the engineers and the designer guys, but you also have all the machinists and the welders to put everything together. And if you don't have both, then it's just not going to work at all. So I started getting involved in the outreach for the high school and middle school teachers for because material science in general is not a widely discussed topic. It
Mhm.
doesn't sound sexy. It doesn't sound interesting. Like the last person that made it interesting was Buckminster back in the what 70s with the buckyballs.
Right.
And
Yeah.
our infrastructure relies on steel and aluminum, aluminum for aerospace, steel for buildings and roadways, and concretes that last under extreme weather conditions and tons of traffic. And that's not stopping. That's not going away. So the need for the plain Jane workaday materials is still very much there. In addition to the innovative stuff, people trying to work on new alloys, and I think it all needs a lot of support. And everybody that is in the ASM Houston chapter agrees. A lot of the old guys are starting to retire or are looking to retire and need new people to come into that workspace to keep it thriving and healthy. So I'm trying to help spread the word that yeah, material sounds boring, but there's actually a lot more going on into it than I would have even suspected when I was on the outside of it. I just learned it once I got in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of applicable to a lot of different professions out there. Is like, students going through high school don't really realize what goes into these professions. And so having someone like an ASM or someone like an association to help spread the word about what does it really mean and how, one, how lucrative it could be, and two, how important it really is, to the culture. So speaking of kind of two very different areas here, right? We have history and social studies, and we have science, engineering, and mathematics. This was by design. I wanted to get you guys both on this podcast to talk about the idea of making content relevant because, like I said before, it transcends content. No matter what we teach, we have students sitting in our classrooms that all ask the same question, and that is, why do we need to know this, right? So I'm going to throw it back to y'all and say, what sort of strategies do you have to really impress upon students how important it is to know your particular area? And Dr. Randolph, why don't you start?
Yeah, it's so much of in the history classroom, this question of like, why would we ever need to know this? Why do we need to know like what this president did in the 1880s or something like that? Well, if you want to watch the new Netflix series on James Garfield, highly recommended there for just such a thing. But often I think it's preconceptions about rote memorization that come with history education. Like folks are bringing in ideas that you've got to memorize dates and people and old things that happened, and that you'll
Right.
be sort of judged by your ability to do that. And that's just really not what the history classroom at college is about. It's about studying the past, and that includes a lot more than just sort of rote memorization. In fact, we have the internet now. We don't really need to sort of lock things away. It's important. Like, I need you to know who James Garfield was. I need you to know who Martin Luther King Jr. was, things like that. But otherwise, we're asking bigger questions like how do historians know what actually happened? Why would we ever need more than one book on a historical topic like the
Right.
American Civil War? Something like that. And when you get students thinking about that, you can get them thinking much more about the building blocks of history and history making and history writing, like the original historical evidence that historians use, letters, diaries, reports from the government. And those sorts of questions actually open worlds that like it's somewhat immediately evident and why you would need to know something. And also it's just interesting. Like you sort of get a hook set with students when you get them thinking about like who decides what history means, right? Who
Right.
decides what we learn from it, and who decides how we apply those lessons to our modern world? So I try to give students sort of a historical toolkit, an intellectual toolkit, much more than cramming content and information down their throats. And one of the ways that historians do this is to teach people to think contingently. We think about it, right? So thinking about past actors sort of living in a moment where the future can't be understood the way that we, like looking back in hindsight, understand.
Sure. Yeah.
So, things that we encounter today aren't timeless. You can tell a history, and that's about balancing continuity and change over time. And, outcomes weren't destined. So they were a mix of intentions and accidents. And getting students to sort of put themselves in the shoes of people in the past and see from that way is really important.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. It's almost like, okay, our present is the way it is because of our history. And so like learning about all of the things that led up to those decisions and what outcomes came from those decisions. One student can think, well, like, yeah, of course it had to happen this way because this is where we live. But that wasn't the case, right? And that was a really good point. When someone was making a decision, they had no idea what the outcome was going to be. They didn't know idea the result of the battle was going to be, for an example. So that's really, really cool. And I love your idea of the, who decides. In a previous episode of this particular series, actually, I talked to a social studies teacher about use of inquiry in the classroom, use of questioning and that sort of thing. And that is a really awesome way to get students to just think about, okay, like, well, how does my viewpoint differ from someone else's viewpoint? Why do we need to take a look at everyone else's viewpoint? Because who's making those decisions? That's really cool. Okay, so I'm gonna jump over though to the sciences, and I feel like your answer is going to be similar, but also very, very different. So, how do we impress upon the importance of the science, engineering, and math?
Honestly, I think of it as two primary fold. One is everybody's gonna need a job, everybody's gonna need money, and you got to find some way to earn it. Like I like to eat, I like to live under a roof, I like to have electricity and internet. It sounds a little odd to boil it down to that far, but you got to do something for a living. But the other part of it is, if you want to do well in your profession, regardless of whatever the profession is, you have to think about it critically, and just as Justin was saying, you have to put it in context for what's going on, locally, globally around you right now, and what the trends have been in the previous 10 years, 20 years, 40 years that are leading up to where you're at, to try to look forward to where it's going. One of the things I always heard growing up is you don't want to train for the jobs that they need right now. You want to try to figure out what the jobs that are going to be needed in 10, 15, 20 years, which is very hard to look forward if you don't look at some of those past trends and look at the larger context like Justin was talking about. So I think that there's a really important mental cross connection right there, just a general attitude of looking at how things interlace. But for how to, from a science perspective of how to make things relevant and why it even matters, a lot of people complain about learning math. Like I've got a second grade daughter, and she's like, and she hasn't asked the question of why do I need to learn multiplication, but you can tell it's kind of like there's like, well, I can already add really well. Why would I need to learn to multiply? Well,
Yeah,
the
for
answer is it's a
reasons.
lot. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons why it's really useful to learn to multiply, and then because then you have to learn division, and then you learn geometry and blah blah blah. Now, will a lot of people use all of those? No, no, we're not going to pretend that we do. But I grew up doing a lot of woodworking, craft work, and hobby work, and you don't know what tools you're going to need until you need them. And if you don't already have the tool, you have to go to the store, get it, learn how to use it. If you already have the tool right there, you can just get up and go. So the more tools you have in your mental toolbox and your personal skill set, the more prepared you are for where you're going. Because the job that I have right now, I didn't even know it existed. Failure analysis, I'd never heard of it till I accidentally found the job posting. I couldn't prepare for it in school because I didn't know it existed. I couldn't
Right.
plan for it because I didn't know it existed, but I fell into it and I've been doing it for 17 years and I absolutely love it. And it's hard to find a job that pays well that you enjoy doing.
That's
Uh,
true.
but so, one of the things that college teaches you is not just the skills you're going to need, but also it teaches you to learn how to learn well and to learn what you need once you learn what you need to know. So that in and of itself is a useful skill set as well that I think is cross discipline true.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting, and I'm loving the juxtaposition a little bit of learning history and where we came from that informs our present and future, and then what you're saying about our ability to understand science and engineering math is almost to project into the future to understand where we're going to be going, and all of it gives us a little bit of understanding about where we are right now. Right, it's all just trying to figure out trends and figure out where we're going to be going. I love that your comment about preparing for jobs in the future. So I participated in a little bit of quantum physics stuff that was going on in high schools and the standards here in Texas, and that was something that was coming up through the sort of quantum revolutions that have been happening over the last 50 or so years. Is that the professions that are going to be quantum heavy don't even exist yet. And so we need to be learning more about what it is going on now so that the students are going to be prepared to jump into a profession that doesn't even exist yet. So that's really cool. So okay, I'm gonna come back to Dr. Randolph and say, okay, when discussing a historical event like an economic depression, social movement, how can teachers effectively draw parallels to current societal challenges or debates to create that lasting relevance? So I guess essentially talking about something that happened a long time ago that was very, very influential. How do we draw that connection? How do we draw those parallels back to what's going on now to really cement the learning?
Yeah, great question. I love, and I'm going to sort of go down the social movement. I love to find college students acting in the past and to drop my students into their shoes to consider the decisions that they had to make and sort of what the sort of decision tree and calculus that they were making looked like. And one of the examples that I like to use, and I in fact frame my entire intro to U.S. history from like the Civil War to the present around the example of the Freedom Riders. So, for those of you unaware, the Freedom Riders were a group of many students, but also non-students in May of 1961 who were part of the Congress of Racial Equality's attempts to desegregate interstate busing.
Mhm.
So think about, far fewer personal automobiles, busing dictating much more of life, and the trick was to try to get the federal law on desegregated busing so that, everyone's equal sitting on buses, sitting in bus stations and using restrooms and restaurants and bus stations to get that applied to southern states who are sort of intransigently refusing to desegregate. So the Freedom Riders start in Washington, D.C., and they are heading towards New Orleans. And the point is that they are going to flaunt these laws. They are going to, when black riders are told to sit in the back of the bus, they're not going to do it. When they're told, to go to the black side of the bus station, they're not going to do it, right? So they do this and they spark pushback from local authorities all the way down. And then they get into Alabama and things sort of explode, right? Somewhat literally. In Anniston, Alabama, the bus is firebombed. They get to Birmingham, Alabama, and there's a lot of physical violence. And so there's a big moment. There's like a watershed moment where activists have to decide, is enough enough? Like, have we made our case? Is this getting to be so threatening to all of us? Or could we potentially do harm to the movement against sort of racial equality in the nation if we keep going? And in Nashville, Tennessee, a group of students at historically black colleges and universities, led by a student named Diane Nash, are faced with the decision on whether they're going to keep the freedom rides going, whether they're going to pick up where the group that made it to Birmingham left off. Diane Nash is fielding phone calls from the president. So John F. Kennedy's on the phone saying, like, I'm asking you, stop. Do not send anyone further. And Diane Nash very famously says, like, Mr. President, I cannot do that. We cannot stop. And so this is an example like of college students, like who many of whom are in their like final semester of college, actually, and alongside deciding like, how much physical violence am I willing to take on? Am I ready to die if that comes to it? Incarceration, criminal records that will like come from my being arrested, and that this is occurring during their final exams. Like they are having to make a decision on whether or not to like basically drop out of school during their final exams to go and do something that is this important to them. And of course, the rest is history. They keep going and they force their sort of mass incarceration in Jackson, Mississippi, that brings waves and waves and federal more intervention and national notoriety around their fight.
So that's a really great technique, I think, is to really kind of drop them into that situation. It's like, look, here is someone who is essentially you, however many years ago, making these decisions, and ask the question like, what would you do, right? I mean, how would you have reacted, or what would you be doing now if you were faced with a similar situation? I really love that, and so making it relevant to students is about connecting to their lives, right? Connecting to where they are right then and there. So on the science side, I can say that science is all about observing the world around us, right? I mean, that is essentially how we define science, is the observation of the world around us and making sense of it. So how does using like a material science topic within lessons help create relevance and engagement for students?
As I'm not a teacher, I will not pretend to be a teacher, but I have talked to a lot of teachers with the outreach that we have done from elementary school, middle school, high school, and some going into college, finishing their college teaching. We've had a nice cross section of people that we've gotten to work with and help, and their general responses have been a lot of kids, especially whether just in general, video games, tablets, whatever. Kids are have a tendency to be very visual learners, and if you can show them something and get them to put hands on something and feel the thing, it makes it mean a lot more. It makes it a lot more
Mm-hmm.
relevant. So trying to saying the word carbon fiber composites for airplane skins. Okay, cool. Sounds very sciencey. The master teachers that we bring in teach how to make a very basic cement that they can actually mix in the classroom, and then they can make little bricks of it and drop them on a hard floor and watch them break. But then they take something as simple as Easter basket grass and lay that in one direction or multiple directions crossways in the fire in the cement that they make, and then practice dropping those. And you can tangibly, audibly, kids love messes. You're making, you're breaking rocks. It's cool. So you can see what you with your hands have done to improve a material's properties, structural resistance to cracking and fracturing, and or even if it does crack, it does crack, but it doesn't break away, and where those actually do make a difference. And then I like to provide, because I work in failure analysis, for better and worse, has a very direct response to issues that happen in real life. So I do work with litigation and insurance cases where people get injured, where people get killed, where things break that cost a lot of money. And there are some very famous historical ones, like the Tulsa Bridge, the Galloping Gertie that swung. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but it caused a lot of monetary damage and havoc on the highway. The ballroom collapse in, what was it, Missouri? I'm drawing a blank on where it was now, but the Hyatt region, the Hyatt ballroom collapse, which that killed, I think, like 40 or 50 people, if I remember right. I mean, it was a big deal. And these things still keep happening. The space shuttle that blew up from a bad O-ring. So
Right.
even very simple things as a small shiny black circle, a little gasket made a huge impact. So tying it back and forth too, you can put hands on. There's lots of really great little experiments with a little plastic shrinky dinks where you can draw on it and heat it up and watch it shrink to the reinforced cement. There's a bunch of really cool hands-on demos you can do that put chemistry and physics and civil engineering and mechanical engineering in your hands, that you can feel and see what makes a difference. I think connecting that, giving those tools to the teachers to bring those to the kids, help make hand wavy science or hand wavy engineering, especially, and not to knock the teachers, but I'm not a teacher, so I don't understand teaching, and most of them are not engineers or scientists, so they don't know what it
True.
is that we actually do. Like, most engineers don't even know what we do because it's such a ridiculously broad field.
Yeah.
I haven't got a clue what most chemical engineers do. So it's a remarkably broad field that you can fall. Like, I went into it thinking I wanted to make robots. I'm not making robots. I'm doing failure analysis. So that's just where I accidentally got into, but that's what opened up for me.
What you described, one of the activities about dropping something and looking to see if it's going to break. I mean, I used that in my physics classroom many times, right? But you took that and you went a different way with it. You went into discussing a profession, discussing failure analysis, discussing engineering. There's so many different lenses that we can look at the same thing with, and look at it. Is this a cause and effect relationship? Is this going to be I'm thinking about some of the other reoccurring themes and concepts that we have in our standards now. We can take a look at one event in a number of different ways. And I kind of feel like that's similar to, I'm going to throw it back to you, Dr. Randolph. You could take a look at one event in several different ways. Now, you may not necessarily have the manipulative part of it, but I mean, maybe you do. I mean, how can you take one event and analyze it from a variety of different motivations?
Yeah, I mean, I really love the term of art failure analysis from Adam's line of work because I feel like historians largely are doing failure analysis frequently. Sometimes things go well, but often the historians are showing up when things go not so well. And we're called upon to sort of explain what on earth happened, you know. And part of that is hindsight, right? What looks like a failure now doesn't always look like a failure, and there's a lot of memory and forgetting involved. You know, one example that comes to mind, I just got done teaching a class on the history of law enforcement in America and public memory. So the name of the class was Policing and Public Memory, and it was a methods class, so it's like the sophomore capstone where students come in and for the first time really, you know, are forced to find historical documents and forced to deal with what historians have already said about the very thing, the very documents that they're reading. And you know, one beauty of this class is students get to choose their own adventure. They get to follow their own passions and curiosities down the path to discovery. And one, you know, just incredible research project came out of this class. So it's 1973 in Oakland, California. And one night, a police helicopter drops out of the sky. It lands on a city street. Tragically, two law enforcement officers are killed. You know, these are men with families and connections and community ties. And that, you know, could have been sort of the beginning and end of the story, but it's not. And the story gets a lot more complicated. The student came to this just by finding their names on a memorial wall
Wow.
in Oakland, where they're from. And so, you know, I often get students to sort of start in that place where, you know, well, how's it being remembered now? And then you look back and see how things are so different or how they might have gone other ways. And so this event, to answer your question, is looked at from so many different angles and all sort of the paranoias and sort of I don't know, intellectual failures of its day are sort of projected upon it. The chief of police comes out and says, actually, these police officers were assassinated. You know, they were shot out of the sky. And this creates a nationwide sort of furor and manhunt. Governor of California, Ronald Reagan at the time, lists a $10,000 reward for the people who shot these police officers out of the sky. Um, then there's like this Black nationalist guerrilla group that's sort of claiming that they shot the people out of the sky. And then it turns out that none of this happened.
Wow.
Right. So, you know, there was some reason to think that the officers had been shot, but they had not been shot. There was just a catastrophic engine failure on the helicopter and they crashed. But like you find this moment where everyone's sort of political I don't know, commitments and preconceived notions of the world get to be mapped onto something. And then, you know, in time it gets resolved. And it ends up being a multi-million dollar lawsuit against like General Electric and the other companies that made the helicopter and that led to its crash. But, you know, none of the other stuff happened. You know, there was no assassination. And certainly the group that claimed responsibility was just trying to draw attention to their own political project, which was to get some prisoners released, who they said were political prisoners. That's the kind of thing that I love, like seeing unfold in real time from students.
And I think that's a perfect example of that's leading me into this next question about how teachers from different subjects like science and history could collaborate to demonstrate the interconnectedness of their fields and make both subjects relevant. I mean, because you're essentially talking about something that has historical relevance and importance, but it came down to a mechanical failure, which falls right underneath Adam your line of work. So, how important is it for teachers of different subjects to work together so that students get a more holistic understanding of the world around them? Adam, I'll start with you because the engine failure kind of goes right up your alley. Do you have any lessons or anything from the ASM materials that kind of pull in some of that history stuff, or do you see the relevance there?
Absolutely. And kind of as we talked about earlier, like nothing happens in a vacuum. So just like all the social movements in history, materials looking forward in jobs, nothing's happening in a vacuum. So there are some really fantastic, since my gig is failure analysis, there are some really fantastic, depending on your perspective, historical failures. Like there's a huge the molasses flood in Boston back in the early 1800s. That was a giant mechanical failure that killed a lot of people as these massive vats of slow moving molasses broke out of their vats and went down, killed drowned a bunch of workers and went out into the streets and drowned more people and animals and all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
The ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they gained prominency from a series of gigantic mechanical failures in the early days of steam heating. So you have all the coal boilers, the historical mechanics and engineering of that, of just all the steam systems, which goes into coal history and manufacturing history. But from a safety and engineering perspective, they were making effectively what is a water heater if it doesn't have an outlet and it's, something trips and it starts building up too much heat and too much pressure, you have a 40 or 50 gallon pipe bomb in your house. And there are
Right.
videos of fire departments making fake, where they make their fake houses that they burn down for practice, setting off some of those water heaters where they've disabled the HPHT safety valve, and it effectively vaporizes the house or the majority of the house. And this happened a lot of times with people in their houses back in the day, and that's where the American Society of Mechanical Engineer pressure vessel code was birthed. So it has this series of historical failures, mechanical engineering failures, that led to people getting together and realizing, okay, we need to do something about this. This is killing people. We need some standards. We need some safety guidelines. We need some consistent rules for manufacturers to follow and for these to be examined and maintained by, and
Right.
in order to improve the safety for the public going forward. So that was actually the development of the pressure vessel code from the American Society of Mechanical Engineering. American Society of Metals, now ASM, has a similar, not quite as graphic development, but a lot of those societies that developed back in those years, talking about trying to standardize how steels get made, how to standardize the nomenclature. So if I can say this name of steel, and you know what I mean when I say that name of steel, so we're not all working by different playbooks like a mattress store that has 15 different names for the same mattress. But now, so if we're using the same nomenclature, we can have a more intelligent and cogent conversation from company to company to company and across industries. And that gets kind of codified as it goes forward through the years. But to tie it back and forth, there are a lot of big historical failures that I think, so engineers can kind of tip the hat towards history and show there's a lot of interesting things that happened and that are the reason that we have a lot of the rules and safety guidelines and manufacturing guidelines and even some of the just habits that we have right now that weren't always habits, and they came around for very good reasons because we
Right.
wanted to stop killing so many kids.
Yeah. Dr. Randolph, I'll kind of throw it to you. Same question. I mean, like, how much does the science aspect of it play into what you talk about from the historical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to have any pure answers here.
Yeah.
I think it's a big problem. We live in very siloed professions, and
Mm.
it's difficult sometimes even to talk to much nearer peer fields like sociology, literature, political science. So I think it's important for, the studies, that we think of, the interdisciplinary studies and departments that are generated by this very cross-sectional thinking that you're thinking about.
Hmm.
So science and technology studies is a great one where historians work right alongside folks who have this sort of engineering mindset and view of the world and of knowledge creation. But, we also have American studies, Africana studies, places where different fields come together and things. So, and I think this is part of what's so valuable about a holistic liberal arts education that universities that offer, as opposed to say a purely vocational training.
Hmm.
I want my students to go into Adams training and line of work, thinking like a historian, even if they're never paid to be a historian.
Right.
I want them to ask, are we getting the full picture? What drove this particular innovation, right? As Adam is really laying out. What are its costs and benefits, right? How can it be better? How can it be worse? But also, I'll just say, I think it would be really beneficial for us, for instance, historians, to step into science classrooms more often because I love seeing other learning environments, from what I can learn about it as a pedagogue, but I also love seeing if I can sort of suss out what my students are seeing elsewhere and trying
Sure.
to sort of incorporate that into what I try to do into my own classroom.
Yeah, it's great. I always advocated for any of our teachers, any of our newer teachers, to go and visit other people's classrooms, regardless of what the subject is. I mean, if you're teaching math and science, go visit an English classroom because they're really good at classroom discussions and getting people to talk about things. And so, I mean, it doesn't matter who it is. If it's a good instructor, go and visit that classroom. But yeah, to circle back around, I mean, in my own experience, I remember a specific lesson I would do in astronomy all the time, which was about understanding the sunspot cycle and how that has influenced solar output and therefore climate here on Earth. And there was something called the Maunder minimum that happened in the 1800s, where sunspots virtually disappeared from the sun, which indicated that the sun was going through less of energy output. And was that the cause for, the year without a summer? We looked at art and we looked at literature and we looked at music to see if we could find, some evidence for correlation, right, between the two events. So it was a really cool way to bring in history. But as you've kind of mentioned, we are very siloed. I mean, these things are sometimes one-off things that we do in the classroom just to say, hey, let's take an interesting look at it. The more that we can, I think, produce a holistic view of the world around us, whether that's from a historical perspective with a little bit of science, or science with it being rooted in the historical importance, I think will be a benefit to all of our students. So we are over time at this point, but it's been a great conversation. I'm going to give both of you an opportunity to talk about any places that our listeners, our pre-service or early career teachers, may be able to go and find some more resources. And Adam, I'll start with you. I know you probably want to talk a little bit about your ASM resources. So where can students learn a little bit more?
Sure thing. So one of the things that we are directly involved in is ASM across the national spectrum. So a lot of the major cities, I know Texas in general has 4 or 5 of these that we put on every year. It's called the Teachers Camp, Materials Teachers Camp. To teach, they bring in a pair of master teachers that are trained to teach the teachers how to understand topics, the spectrum of materials science, so chemistry, physics. We have teachers come in from biology, teachers come in from math, geophysics, environmental engineering, the ones that have just like a STEM class in general, and teach them, how to read the periodic table, how to make the periodic table understandable, how to make physics, friction and polymers and materials and metals, and how to understand the difference between them, so that they understand them enough that they can bring them to their kids. And then, so we put that on once a year. It's a week-long training class. Houston, San Antonio, North Texas, El Paso, and I think there's one more that I'm blanking on right now. But they're all over the country. I know Ann Arbor, Michigan has big one. Boston has big ones. So there are a bunch of them. And then there's a level 1 and level 2 if there's enough interest in. There's some residential camps that go into that. So that's my little spiel from ASM Materials Training Camp. But I know a lot of the other engineering societies have community give back and trainings. The Society of Women Engineers, American Society of Engineering, Mechanical Engineering, welding societies, a lot of them have community give back that are worth looking into if that's close enough to your field to be of interest.
Great. Yeah, awesome. And Dr. Randolph, what about you? Any resources that you want to talk about to help our maybe budding history teachers and how they can do more public history in their classroom?
Sure. Yeah. So Google my name, you'll find my faculty webpage. You can Google my book. It's just out with the University of North Carolina Press, titled Mississippi Law, if you want to learn more about my research. The Journal of Texas History actually has a public history review section, and I'm the public history editor there. So, and that's open access. You don't even need a library login to get a hold of it. But that's, again, the Journal of Texas History. And one last resource that's relatively new, but I think will really inform conversations, at least in my field, and should in the humanities for a little while to come, is the Journal of Southern History has just put out a special issue on teaching. So that's the November 2025 issue of the Journal of Southern History. It's dedicated to teaching about the South and in the South, as we're doing right now.
Great. Well, thank you, both of you, again, so much for your time. That's all the time that we have for today. The Aggie Teach Momentum podcast drops every 2 weeks, so make sure that you are looking for the next episode on Spotify or linked on the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences website. For more information, you can visit our program website at aggieteachartsci.tamu.edu. That is aggieteach, ARTSCI.tamu.edu. Thanks and gig 'em.